Hi, welcome to the course. We are going to talk about assessment. After this part of the course, you will be able to understand key principles of testing and assessment, recognize key features of formal, informal, summative, and formative assessment, recognize different types of formal and informal assessment, identify reasons for using different kinds of assessment with learners, learn ways of assessing elements that are not about language ability, for example, behavior, attitude, motivation, participation. Teaching usually involves some kind of testing. Sometimes tests link very closely to the language the teachers teach. On the other hand, in some teaching situations, teachers may assess learners' behavior, attitude, or ability to work with their classmates. There are many ways of assessing both the linguistic and non-linguistic factors related to a learner's development and progress. The assessment you use will depend on the age group you teach, your teaching situation, and your learner's needs. Different members of the educational process have different opinions about the assessment. In my school, for example, we focus on things like participation in class, working with classmates, and handing in tidy work when we assess pupils. Although this isn't about their language ability, it's real helpful. The assessment process can be not understandable for the parents. They don't understand sometimes when their daughter or son gets comments on his/her English writing, such as very good or try harder. They are not sure if that helps their kids to improve. They think they are trying hard when they do their schoolwork and homework. They don't know what the teacher wants them to do differently. The student's opinion is the following. Some of them don't like tests in school. Sometimes the tests are like the work they've done in class. They are difficult, but they've studied for them. But other times they have to answer questions about things they haven't done in class. They don't think that's fair. The key concepts of the assessments are: first of all, you need to remember that assessment is not just about testing learners and giving them exams. There are many different ways of assessing learners. Teachers can assess learners in the classroom as part of a lesson. Assessment measures what learners already know. Assessment measures what learners need to learn. One of the principles of assessment is validity. If you want to assess your learner's speaking skills, then the activity you use to do this needs to be a speaking activity, not a writing activity. It sounds really obvious, but I think it's easy to make that mistake. So, if you ask learners to write dialogue, then it's not really a valid assessment of speaking skills. Also, assessing should be in the same way that you teach. For example, you may do lots of communicative activities in class and then assess the learners in a sit-down test using written multiple-choice questions. Obviously, this is a quick and easy way of assessing language knowledge, but if you want to test communication skills, you should also use another test to see if learners can actually use the language communicatively. You need to use something similar to the kinds of activities that have been doing in class. When we are talking about how practical an assessment is, we evaluate if an assessment takes a lot of time to prepare or mark, or even if it takes a lot of class time to do, then it's not very practical. If it's expensive, for example, it costs a lot to make the copies, or you need to use special equipment, then it's not practical as well. So, practicality is about how many resources you need for an assessment. The next two principles of assessment are reliability and fairness. Talking about reliability, basically we ask ourselves the question, if the learners did the assessment again the next day, would they get the same results? Also, it's mostly about how the assessment is marked and about the type of assessment. If it's right or wrong answer, like a multiple choice question, then it's easy to see if it's right or wrong. But if it's something about a piece of writing or a conversation, then it's harder to give a score like 68% because it's very subjective. It depends on the opinion of the marker. Another marker might have a different opinion, so would give a different grade. That's why we need to have and use clear criteria for marking, so we know exactly what we are looking for and how we are marking the assessments. And we also need to think about their age and stage of development. It's not fair to give them a question where they have to do something that they are not ready to do, like asking younger primary learners to solve a difficult problem or to use higher order thinking skills. So fairness is about how far an assessment gives meaningful information about individual learners' language ability and treats all learners equally. The next principles are impact and washback. Impact means the effect that a person, event, or situation has on someone or something. So it must be the effect that the assessment has on the learners as well as on others in society and on teachers, of course, too. If learners do well in an assessment, that it will give them confidence and motivation and have the same effect on their teachers. It might help learners in their life to pass an exam or have a negative effect if they don't pass it. Sometimes teachers spend a lot of time in class preparing learners for end-of-year assessments and other assessments that have to do to go to secondary school. And that could be positive and negative. If the assessment encourages us to use good teaching and learning strategies to prepare for it, then it's positive. Like if we do a lot of pair work speaking activities to prepare for a speaking assessment, that's called washback. So, the effect of an assessment on learners, learning and teaching, that's impact. An effect on the quality of teaching and learning as learners prepare, that's washback. Let's see the example. Learners spend a lesson practicing answering multiple choice questions using a special answer sheet that they will use in next week's assessment. Does it show washback? Yes, this is an example of washback, but example of negative washback, because the activity is not very useful for language learning. Let's practice on deciding how far the assessments meet some of the principles. This is the situation. A teacher wants to assess her learners' skills in classroom reading activities. Learners do a reading activity from their course book. She monitors while they do the activity and asks different learners to read their answers aloud. She gives them grades for pronunciation according to the criteria that she uses for all the learners. So, this assessment is not reliable because the teacher uses criteria to assess pronunciation but not the reading skills. However, this assessment is practical because it doesn't take much time to prepare or mark. This assessment is valid because it uses reading activities from the course book. This assessment can be more valid if the teacher used criteria to assess the learner's reading skills. Let's have a look at another example. A teacher wants to assess her learner's speaking skills. In class, learners did some practice in pairs, asking and answering questions about themselves. The teacher interviews each learner and asks the learners the same questions that they have practiced. She uses the criteria for fluency, pronunciation, language, and communication to give each student a grade. There are 40 students in the class. So this assessment is reliable because the teacher uses the same criteria to assess all learners. This assessment, however, is not practical because it takes a long time to interview all the learners. This assessment is valid because the teacher assesses speaking skills in the same way as learners practiced in the class. This assessment has a positive washback because practicing for the task is useful for language learning. Now we are going to have a look at different approaches to assessment. Assessment can be formal. Formal assessment is a way of measuring how well a learner has achieved or is achieving the learning objectives. It usually has high reliability, but formal assessments may need time and money to produce and administer. If the assessment activities are not the same style as the ones learners are used to doing in the class, then a formal assessment may be low on validity. This formal assessment usually is planned by an education authority or school. This kind of assessment is likely to be high stakes. What does it mean? That means that it has an important consequence, like passing or failing a class or getting into secondary school. Learners do formal assessment on their own, with no help from the teacher or under exam conditions. Informal assessment, where assessment takes place in the classroom under normal classroom conditions. It is often less systematic and can measure achievement or progress. It's a highly valid way to assess because teachers use normal classroom activities, but it can be low in reliability unless the teacher plans carefully how to mark it. Informal assessment is not usually high stakes, but teachers might use information from informal assessment over the year to come to a final grade or even a pass-fail decision about the learner. Learners often have help and support. Learners do it individually or in groups. Formal and informal assessment can be both used to measure either achievements or progress. Formal assessments are also usually summative. Learners do summative assessment at the end of the period of learning. For example, as an end-of-year assessment or at the end of term. Usually measures achievement of learning objectives. Usually high stakes. Learners receive final scores, grades, or reports. May be used to make decisions for teaching in the following year. Informal assessment is usually formative. Formative assessment takes place during the period of learning or regularly. Teachers use formative assessment to help them make decisions about what they need to focus on next to improve learners' learning. We do this informally by monitoring learners, and we can give feedback to our learners so that they can improve their learning too. Teachers can give feedback in different ways, such as using a progress report, or they may use grades and scores which they discuss with their learners to identify what learners need to focus on. It's often better to give learners feedback and help them to see how they can improve, rather than just using a grade for formative assessment. However, if you give learners a grade, then they may just focus on this, rather than the areas that they need to work on. Through formative assessment, we can see where learners are having problems and make sure that we deal with those problems. We might also assess our learners at the beginning of the year or unit and see where we need to focus our teaching in that year or unit. Formative assessment is low stakes because it doesn't have a consequence like passing or failing a class. The focus is on what the learners need to do to progress, so it has a high value because it helps improve learning. Let's practice. Read what the teacher says and decide whether it is a formal or informal assessment. I monitor and watch my learners as they do classroom activities, and I make notes about their strengths and any areas they have problems with. I often use my notes to help me plan the next lesson. What kind of assessment is it? Yes, it's an informal, formative assessment. When we think about the word assessment in our English language classroom, we often think about the assessing language skills. But it is also possible and very useful to assess other areas that are not about language. Usually, though, non-linguistic factors include areas that will have impact on how successful the learner is. Things like motivation and attitude, for example, how the learner approaches learning English or how well they participate in class. Cooperation with others, including with their classmates as well as the teacher, is also important for successful language learning. You could have a look how well organized the learners are, how well they keep their notes and papers, and consider their handwriting. Learning strategies is another area to think about. This is about things like how well learners can use dictionaries, the internet or other resources, how they plan and review their work or self-correct. Lastly, teachers can also assess behavior. Criteria for assessing cooperation with others. The learner interacts positively with a partner during pair work activities. The learner interacts positively and contributes to group activities. The learner is willing to contribute to whole class activities or to share their ideas and understanding. Criteria for assessing motivation and attitude. The learner participates actively in classroom activities. The learner shows interest in classroom activities and learning. The learner does homework activities as asked. The learner is willing to do what the teacher asks him or her to do. Criteria for assessing organization. The learner takes care to write well and keep the pages neat. The learner takes care of add drawings, for example, as best as he or she can. The learner keeps his or her books and notes carefully so they do not get damaged or lost. Criteria for assessing learning strategies. The learner is beginning to work more by herself without the teacher's support. The learner is beginning to use resources to support his or her own learning, for example, dictionary, internet. The learner can self-correct orally and or in written work. Behavior affects everything, so we might not assess it separately. If, however, you have learners who misbehave in your class, you might want to assess behavior separately in some way. It may be useful to look at the kind of behavior you expect or want from your learners, rather than the negative behavior that these children are showing. For example, imagine a class with a learner who doesn't listen and disturbs classmates during class. In this situation, you could assess all the learners in the class on their listening and focus on listening instructions instead of focusing on talking too much or disturbing classmates. We should use criteria for what we expect from learners and assess learners according to these criteria. Then we can talk to learners about how well they are doing, as well as they can do to improve. We can also share the results of these findings with other teachers in the class. In this example, you can see how the teacher observed how the learner cooperated, but not every lesson, only twice a month. From the observation, you can notice that the learner seems to be motivated and willing to participate when working in pairs, more than in groups or whole class activities, but the learner seemed to improve a little in the whole class group activities. In this example, the teacher wrote comments about different aspects of this learner's ability to work independently at the end of the term. This learner seemed to be developing some of her learning strategies and ability to work independently. She may need encouragement to use more resources to help her learn. In short, you learned about ways of checking if specific tasks and tests you use for assessment fit with these principles. Ask yourself, is the test reliable? Yes, it would give the same results if the learners took it again. Different teachers use the same methods of marking or criteria. Practical? Yes, a test is easy to create, administer and mark. Fair? Yes, when the marking is clear and there is the same for all learners and at the right level.